Yeah, I guess you could use that. Good evening. I'm Nancy Cohen. I'm the museum manager, and I want to welcome you tonight to our wonderful program with Ira Giller and Sarah Giller Nelson, Designing the Good Life in honor of their father and grandfather, Norman. So I'm going to read something from Susan Gladstone, who's the executive director. There's a little feedback that she gave me tonight. She's unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, so she's very sorry and asked me to read this on her behalf. And she says, as you walked up the stairs to the museum tonight and into the main gallery, I hope you noticed how beautiful the museum looks. I hope you noticed that every inch of the museum has been painted, polished, paved, and preserved from the new shining roof to the parking lot. Please join me in thanking our board chair and official architectural consultant, Ira Giller, for his help, guidance, and expertise in all aspects of the restoration of this building. So thank you, Ira. And a special thank you as well to Sarah Giller Nelson for her help in organizing over 25 years worth of paper and storage. I'm sure there's more to come. Together, Team Giller has helped us begin this new post-pandemic phase of our history in our magnificent home. So thank you for helping us get it all sorted out. And thank you for joining us tonight. And please help us keep this beautiful home and our wonderful programming sustainable. And if you're not a member, I encourage you to join and become one. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Jacqueline Goldstein, the curator, who will be the moderator for tonight's program. And I'm trying to record it on Zoom. That's why we're seeing above your head, and hopefully it'll turn out so those of you who couldn't make it will be able to see it on our YouTube channel. So thank you. And Jackie, you see how low I'm holding it? That's where you got to be.
How is this? How is this? Okay. This evening is really, I'm just so thrilled to do this evening. Because not only do I really respect Ira and his work, it's also such a pleasure to have worked with Sarah and so much of the bits and pieces you throughout the show, Norman's comments. I wanted to make sure that I could do that. It's courtesy of Sarah, getting everything written down and just beautiful. So Sarah, I want to start with you. Your grandfather is considered the godfather of MiMo. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think I should start. I wanted to a little bit of background about what MiMo is. In 1999, Randall Robinson and Terry D'Amico, who I think now is on the city council at Bay Harbor, launched a historic preservation movement when they coined the term MiMo. And they had been seeing structures built in the mid-century, but also versions of modernism that were very exuberant and joyful. And structures like this that they had fallen in love with suddenly come into disrepair and be torn down. And so they wanted to rediscover this time style of architecture, just like what had happened with the Art Deco. And as they did some research into the buildings, they made the connection with my grandfather, Norman, who had designed many structures all over the city and all over the region in the 50s and 60s. And he also, at that point, this was the early 2000s, was still alive and had always been with my grandmother a bit of a pack rat, which is why we have this lovely exhibition, why I was able to work on a book, because all of these objects and images they had in the office in their house. It was just a matter of unearthing it. By that point, the style had fallen out of favor for a while and he was retired and he was just very happy. For those of us that knew him, he always was happy to share a story and talk about his life and was very, very charming. And so contributed interest in his work in particular and MiMo in general really started to grow. And it was around this time that I got involved and decided to work on a book with him and was able to unearth and almost rediscover so many images, stories, projects, visions that he and his contemporaries had. So the godfather of the MiMo is he was one of a handful of very active architects working in Miami, in South Florida, in mid-century, dealing with this style. It was, nicknamed the architecture of joy and architecture of whimsy, where they took basic modernist forms of, reduced lines, less ornamentation, different ways of building where instead of having walls that were supporting the structure with windows punched through, the supports were recessed so you could have walls of glass. And he, along with his other MiMo colleagues, regional modernists, took it. I'd read a comment that MiMo is like modernism came dancing in the Florida sunshine. And that's really what they were trying to do. They were trying to capture this joyful, very optimistic post-war period. And as you look at the different architecture and the different elements from that time, I think that's what a lot of us really love, that you have these zigzags and these huge cantilevered portions of concrete and the beautiful colors. And this is really, he, along with his contemporaries, really enlivened the style at the time.
Want to add a comment. Tonight, I hope that we're going to tell some stories and we're going to tell some history and make it kind of interesting. But Sarah's discussion now, just talking about the book, I wanted to just comment on that process as a father. Her role prior to the book with her grandfather was a relationship, much now that I can relate to my grandchildren. She was a young, very smart, successful student, went off to college, but she was coming into her adulthood, and her grandfather knew her as a grandchild, not as a young adult. And this collaboration became an opportunity for the two of them to gain new insights to each other from a very different perspective. And the book itself is it really expresses that exploration, and it brought me a lot of joy. Was that a question?
Let's talk about the Carillon for a second. This is a building that you worked on 50 years after your father built it. Twofold. The first question is, so obviously you're working on a masterpiece. What responsibilities, number one, before we get into how you worked on it and what you did, what were your responsibilities dealing with the original work? What did you feel that you needed to either preserve or continue?
Carillon presented some very interesting issues. And it's very timely today because of the Deauville. The Deauville and the Carillon were in competition in 1957 to see who was going to open up and be the hotel of the year in Miami Beach. The Carillon survived in its form today because of an activist preservation in the city, but it also survived because the economics still tended to work with preserving much of the building. Not so with the Deauville today, as we've all experienced and seen. But when I got to the Carillon I first touched it in the late 80s when it was still operating as a hotel, and a gentleman bought it and wanted to convert the showroom into a nightclub, a disco, back in the mid 80s. So I worked on it briefly there without changing the hotel, but just redoing the nightclub. I came back later on in 6 or 7 years ago to work on the hotel that had transformed and become Canyon Ranch. And a lot of the key elements of the original design had been lost. You can see it in the renderings, the original renderings here tonight, but there's still the elements of the tower. It used to have a beautiful grand lobby and a lot of very interesting detailing of mid-century modern elements. One of the things that Miami Modern is there was such this wonderful exploration of new materials that just excited the architects, excited the industry as they began applying it. A good part of the lobby had split stone panels that came from Italy. They had a lot of glass mosaic that came from Italy. It has disappeared and it certainly is not in the hotel today. So when I became involved a few years ago, I was looking to try and still retrieve some of the elements that recalled what was there. knowing that some of it had been lost and was never coming back. But I was able to do that with the renovation of the public space and adding the folded plate trellis out on the rear pool deck. So it was a difficult road to go to be able to say, I'm not restoring what was, I'm not preserving it, but I'm still recalling some of the design elements and bringing it forward to 21st century.
I have a question, and I'm trying to remember, I don't remember which project, but you're gonna tell us. Was your father working on a jail or a prison or something like that, and you got in trouble and had to stay in there?
It was the City of Miami Beach Police Station. He designed in the 50s, and there's a picture hanging on the wall in the corner there. I can't tell you. I don't remember. I plead the fifth. But I was threatened with, get in the car, we're going down to the jail and get your act together. Needless to say, I got my act together. I was all of 8 years old, 10 years old, so.
What was really fun was when we came for the opening and we'd never heard this story before and my kids, were like, oh, grandpa went to jail.
And 50 years later, I designed a couple of jails, so maybe it was a foreshadowing this. Some fathers were very heavy-handed with I founded it, this is my company, this is the way it's going to be, you got to fall into it. To my father's credit, he gave me room. It successfully allowed us to interact and sometimes agree to disagree and sometimes to agree. But there wasn't that tight, disciplined, this is what you're stepping into and you got to fall into this mold. So it gave me an opportunity to build upon what I saw and what I experienced, and then to branch out and explore and go in other directions as well. And that's a tough role. I had several of my peers that also went into family businesses here in Miami Beach. Some of them struggled. They couldn't make it work because that dynamic just didn't work right. It wasn't because of me, it was because of him. He had the wisdom. And where did it influence me? In just having a broad mind in what I was doing, trying to be honest and truthful and humble with the work that I was doing, and recognize a greater role in his personality and view of the world. He was born in Jacksonville. He was a Florida Southern guy, but he had a slow, easygoing. Those of you that knew him knew it was a very gentle, easygoing kind of personality. I think some of that rubbed off on me. Some days not. But it's a complex blend of what brought me to where I am today.
One of the things also that I've observed that I think certainly trickled down from Norman was he was very I think he really loved Miami, and he also was, he'd studied Frank Lloyd Wright and was interested too in creating structures that had a relationship with the environment and that very much turned outward. And there was always a conscious effort to relate to the environment, to the culture, to what was going on in the city at the time. And to not, his structures were, again, it was very theatrical and of the time, but they weren't necessarily overwhelming. And one of the things that I've noticed with your architecture is that it still has a conversation with the city. It's not trying to overpower it, or it's restoring it, or it's making it better. You're not coming in, it seems to me almost in sort of an indigenous type of style, appreciation for the place, the people, the user, that you don't necessarily see, or that I think is only a reflection of somebody who has been in a place for a very long time and has a lot of respect for it. And I think that both my father and my grandfather definitely had that. I remember many years ago, you had come up with a design for the theater at the corner of Lincoln and Alton. And it was it seemed very Miami Beach, it was, there was a nod to Art Deco. It wasn't too much. It was also Lincoln Road is the centerpiece. I don't want to compete with that. I just want to add to it. And then the one that the cities, whoever selected it, it was the opposite. It was bombastic. And, now we're used to it, but it just seems so big and so out of place. And I just remember thinking, and then realizing it was something my grandpa did as well, of connecting to the city and the people and having the architecture be in the right scale for its purpose.
And he had a great sense of not only civic pride, but a commitment to the city. And that's one of the other things I learned from him. I became very involved in the community, in leadership, in the museum, to Mount Sinai, the Chamber of Commerce. But all of that came from his example and his leadership a generation earlier in doing very much the same kinds of things. And that impacted, as you captured it well, Sarah, where and what and how, and where did it ultimately come around? We talked about it the other day. He founded the Design Review Board in Miami Beach. Back in the late 70s and the 80s, we were getting a lot of very plain, boxy, small apartment buildings, some very bland commercial buildings. There wasn't a panache that we have today, and he became an advocate in the late 80s of establishing a design review board in Miami Beach. Prior to that, the only land use board was the planning board and the zoning board of adjustment. So in his quiet way, so much that we celebrate today, certainly here and now in many, many other municipalities in South Florida, through design review boards, historic preservation boards, started with his quiet public service and saying, we need to have better design. And when he started, it was done in a very collegial sort of way with a panel of architects and engineers, landscape architect, attorney, sitting on the design review board and collegially saying, you can do better, architect A, or that's very good, keep it up, come back with another good one like that. And it was really the birth of what we celebrate today, 30 years later. And Sarah's the vice chair of the design review board today. Family heritage.
Yes. I'm now in my third year, and it's definitely inspired my interest in giving back to my community was definitely something that I was inspired by. I don't know if I knew that he started it until after I became involved. But I also am constantly, as we're reviewing different designs in the city, I'm constantly thinking about context and place. And is this something appropriate, again, for this community? How does it respond to the environment? How are people gonna, live with it and work in it? And I think a lot, I hope I'm doing him proud. I think, it's good stuff, but I don't think I would have maybe had that sensitivity had I not studied his work and learned about not just, the columns or the use of glass, but also his relationship to his community. In the exhibition, there's also a section that he designed, a plan for South Beach, which I always thought we didn't delve into it extensively when I wrote the book, but now that I'm doing all this other civic planning, I regret that I didn't ask him more about what or why, but one of the things he did remark at one time is he just felt, he just felt moved to contribute, that it wasn't something that was commissioned. He just he thought it would help his community. He presented it, he developed it all on his own, as a volunteer, which I think also, it resonated to me and just told me how much the community had meant to him.
There's a context to that. That plan was done about the same time that Morris Lapidus did the plan for Lincoln Road. Why did it come about? There was a lull in Miami Beach in the late fifties. And they were looking for more economic development for the city. As Art Deco was in the thirties in South Beach, and then mid-century modern began in the twenties and thirties and forties on Collins Avenue. South Beach was falling into disrepair. So there was a need to say, let's rethink what we've got in the birthplace of the city down this end of the city. And that brought about that plan. At the same time, there was a need to say, we need to refocus on the retail component of what Lincoln Road used to be in the fifties, in the forties. And that was what brought about Morris's volunteering also for civic improvement. You know, in some respects, there were very different times architecturally in the community. There were far fewer architects. But we had some very, very interesting buildings, materials, ideas explored, expressions. To me, the building is, one of the things we're missing in so many buildings today is we're not telling stories like we used to as architects. Simple things like, I'm looking at the picture of the Giller building back there. The glass mosaic tower tells a story. This says this is circulation. This is where we go vertically in the building. It's an idea that I've expressed in many different ways, and buildings follow. But that building and similar buildings like that ingrained in me the need to tell a bit of a story in the form of the architecture. And you can see it, you know, through 50, 60 years of work from both of us. We need to be doing more of that today in architectural design. It's the detailing. We're storytellers as architects. And sometimes we tell a good story, and sometimes the pilot doesn't get off the ground. And we need to, as a community, continue to work and build upon the good design that we've got and continue making it even better.
I could also add, there's it reminds me of, there's a condominium project that you did at 8th and Meridian, where it was a creative reuse. It was, you know, I guess it was in the historic district, so you couldn't really tear anything down, but there was a building in the front, and then you backfilled what was the backyard with 4 other units condominium. And so as you're driving down Meridian, you really don't have a sense that there's a much more modern building behind this beautiful Spanish Mediterranean 1930s structure. And it works so well, just melding into the environment, but also being something modern and serving modern purposes. And I feel like, in fact, a number of months ago, I went to a conference sponsored by MDPL about sustainability and architecture in the beach. And we started talking about that because as a way to say, okay, this is how we can live. This is how we can maintain the historic character, but also move forward and manage the needs today that we have. So I think that that's also, you know, part of his legacy and your legacy to, you know, work with what you have, respect the beauty of what already exists, and figure out how to improve upon it.
I want to go back to Carillon for a second. When the Carillon is finished, it's built, it's open, it was a smash, a success. I mean, it was perfect for the city. And the question I have historically is, why do you think in Miami it was such a success? I mean, it is without a doubt, can't even argue it. Posh, sexy, everything. Why did it work?
When the Carillon opened, it was bigger than the Fontainebleau in terms of rooms. The original Fontainebleau, I think, had 500 rooms. Carillon had 620 rooms. It came on in the late 50s when the world was focused on Miami Beach of mid-century. And there weren't very many places to celebrate all of that. Fontainebleau, the Eden Rock, Carillon, the Deauville, and those were the major hotels. And people weren't going to Las Vegas then. They weren't going to the Caribbean. They weren't going to Europe. It was a trek to go to all these places. But it changed very quickly. Because by 1960, the jet plane had come about. Now suddenly, if you were in New York, it wasn't a 4.5 hour propeller plane flight, it was a 2.5 hour jet flight. And you could also go to the Caribbean. You could go out west. Las Vegas was starting to challenge Miami Beach, and suddenly the roles changed. But the showroom that was there was spectacular. All the big names played there. The 1,000 feet on the ocean front, it was a huge property. The location in North Beach was still very fresh because most of North Beach developed post-World War II. So it had that excitement about it, and it had the excitement of the city. Its decline, its long-term decline, was the same decline that all the other major hotels in the city faced. We had competition, and the owners back in the 60s very much had the attitude, we're Miami Beach, you come to us, we don't have to do for you. And suddenly we woke up and we stopped building hotels after 1965, after the Doral was built. And we didn't build a hotel in Miami Beach for 20 years because we had worldwide competition. We didn't have a corporate view on operating many of the hotels, and people had attitudes that the rest of the world wasn't embracing anymore. So they moved on.
What's really interesting to me is that today, after the decline, the Carillon is now right back up there. It's posh. It's, definitely luxury. Talk to me about that historically, and then how you felt working on it.
There was an inflection point historically. Seth, you can relate to this. In the mid-'80s, as a community, we were very much down on our knees as a tourism community. But in the period of 83, 84, 85, the civic community got together and we said, we've got to turn it around. I was president of the Chamber of Commerce at that time. I was the youngest president of the Chamber of Commerce. I worked with the power brokers here in the city and the county, with Ted Harrison to the county manager, and we convinced the power broker leadership in Dade County that we have to come up with a change of where we're going as a community. And that's what started us on this resurgence that came about in the late 80s. It was coupled with the Art Deco movement beginning to take off and to show how historic preservation could be a strong economic base for real estate investment. And suddenly the fashion industry was intrigued with the beautiful buildings of South Beach, began to see the architecture for what it was here in Miami Beach, and the community turned. We're enjoying 30, 35 years of progress of a big cycle as opposed to a small cycle that started in that period of time. And we're the international city of the world to come to, and will continue for many years to come if we don't get the same attitude that the old hoteliers had of, well, come to Miami Beach, we don't have to do anything for you. But things are exciting in Miami now, and our architecture expresses that excitement. Our civic pride, our civic activities, the diversity in our community, the internationalism, the cosmopolitanism of Miami is got huge momentum.
I would also say too, something that makes the city unique, and certainly the Carillon is such a great example, is the architectural details. Along the top of the Carillon are these giant circles. And actually, originally they were designed to have giant bells in them. And a Carillon was a type of bell instrument. And I think it was it wasn't in the budget to add the bells, but that was, still the design had already happened before they cut out the budget. And then with the zigzag, the canopy, I think they've moved it to there's along the wall leading up to the Carillon, there was this accordion fold detail, and then Norman, reads it on the canopy as well. And that also, reinforce the rhythm. It was just a very unique expression. In my mind, it was like the bells were going back and forth, but he had said that it was like an accordion fold, opening and closing. And those details I think are really unique. You don't find those in hotels. They were just, and there they are, they're still there. You can see the 4 giant holes in the top of this building from miles away. And it was that charm and that uniqueness that I think keeps bringing people back and keeps Miami Beach fresh and, people very intrigued, because the new buildings that they make, they don't have those unique details in the same way.
Details tell the story.
Yeah.
We're not telling the stories as best we can. Unfortunately. The folded plate?
Yes.
Well, the folded plate was expressed in the original Carillon in a number of ways. It was originally a folded concrete plate over the entry portico share. And it hung on the columns supporting the tower above it. But that same form was used vertically on the south portion where the showroom was. And so that said, here's where our ballroom is, where the big shows are. And it became an element of continuity to tie back in with the entry plate. So when I ultimately had the opportunity now to design a canopy, a trellis out on the rear terrace, I said, that's a theme, that's an interesting detail. How can I express it, but express it differently in today's terms, as opposed to where it was 50 years ago, and still relate it to the building today? And that's where it successfully fell in place.
And I think that it's those details that when people come and stay in these hotels, that's what they remember of, oh, there was this, zigzag canopy. Who expects that? And that's what I think is part of coming back. It's on the wall right there. Well, everyone will have to take a moment to look at the show, but that's what we're talking about specifically. That's in the back. That was your addition
That was my addition.
based on,
And the photograph in the middle is taken through the canopy, the folded plate canopy, looking up at the original hotel tower. And I love the photograph because it plays the rhythm of the aluminum trellis elements against the rhythm of the window patterns that are on the tower that were somewhat unique to the Carillon as well.
To come about design wise, I know you had a few changes and updates.
Giller building tells a story on many, many levels, but that's it right there. My father started his practice right after he got out of the Navy, the end of World War II, and was immediately inundated with work. His very first project was for his Uncle Ben, and Uncle Ben's grandson, my cousin is here, there you are. But that was his very first commission in 1946. From 1946 to say 1956, for about 10 years, he was just going and going and going. That's what Miami was all about in boom times. And his practice grew and grew, and projects got to be bigger and bigger, and his office was growing. In my father's view, he moved into an office on the top of 420 Lincoln Road. In the day, it was called the Mercantile Bank Building. It's now the Barnett Bank Building. It's Paul Sayas owns the building. And when he moved in there in 1955, this had been the office of Albert Annis, also very prominent architect. My father thought he had really achieved some success, and he outgrew the space. I remember going and visiting there. There was a balcony. We'd go out, we'd watch parades up and down Lincoln Road when conventions came to town. But I also remember as he outgrew the penthouse space, he had an office on the 3rd floor and some space on the 2nd floor, and he was bursting at the seams. So he decided to build an office building for himself. His original concept was the old duplex concept. If he could build 2 floors, he could have his office on 1 floor, and he could rent out the other 4, and the rent would pay for the cost of the mortgage, and in effect, he would have a rent-free office. So Giller Building started out as a two-story, very modest professional building on the west end of 41st Street, that in the mid-50s was a pretty quiet end of 41st Street. There was no I-95, 195, there was no Julia Tuttle Causeway. He had the vision to buy, and interestingly enough, that end of 41st Street had several interior designers, offices and studios. So it was kind of the little mini design center of Miami Beach at the time. So when he came up with the idea and the design, and he started to market it, immediately he rented out the whole first floor. So he said, well, this is good. Maybe I'll add another floor, and I'll rent out 2 floors. And there's a rendering of the 2-story building and the 3-story building in the back. And then ultimately, he made the 4-story building that's originally the Giller Building. And then 5 years later, built an addition with the 6-story addition over the parking lot. But this was his big success of stepping out. It obviously was a symbol of what he was doing, and it was also filled with young professionals like him, doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, that were also all coming out of the war and developing their professional practices. And over the years, it attracted the city's major pediatrician, the city's major children's dentist, the city's major orthodontist. It became a bit of a civic focal point, known to everybody that used it in the community. And about 5 years ago, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, so that we've got it preserved for generations into the future. But this was truly my father's big pride and joy of his professional achievement at that moment in time.
North Shore Band Shell. The North Shore Band Shell, let's talk about it.
North Shore Band Shell just last month was placed on the National Register for Historic Places. But that was a very interesting project. If you look at it in the context, in 1960, we were already starting to have retirees that became very symbolic of what Miami Beach was all about in the 60s and 70s that led to our decline. And the band shell was an effort by the politicians to start making provisions for the new voter constituency. So that this became an outdoor amphitheater. I remember going there after it opened. You'd have senior dances under the moonlight, under the stars. They would dance up a storm. I didn't realize it then, but the seniors were pretty hot back then. But and this was, the city had 2 other open band shells, but none were quite like this. They weren't quite on the ocean front. And it was also an effort to provide some civic amenities in North Beach, which were pretty scarce aside from the library wasn't even there, just the park. And, so it was a big step forward for the city, and it's through its 50, 60 years has hosted some great shows. Mike Douglas did his show there. There were rallies with political conventions when the political conventions were here in the 70s. It's had all sorts of concerts, and it's having a tremendous comeback today under the Rhythm Foundation. They've run some great live music programs almost every week. It's really worth checking out if you haven't been there. And 5 years ago, I became involved with designing a canopy to provide some protection from the sun and the rain so that the facility could be used even more. And the inspiration for the canopy were the horizontal huge cantilevers that were right out of the Jetsons, or the Jetsons were right out of the North Shore Band Shell. But it was very much the era of the 60s in how it developed. And we're talking about details, obviously not as detailed as where we were coming off of Art Deco, early Miami Modern, but it had the essence in many ways. It had an exploration of the use of materials, and it was a timeless expression of it, as it continues today.
I think that one of the reasons why the design is so successful, I should also say too, that I remember our grandfather talking about the challenge of that project is that you needed a built environment, but you also needed it to be very open. And so his solution to that was to put all of the ornament and the decor around the perimeter. And it was how can I make the perimeter of the structure, because I can't build anything in the center, how can I make the perimeter as interesting as possible? And I'm sure there was a budget, but that is when, the MiMo comes in, where let's do these really whimsical, exaggerated cantilevers. And so although it always felt to me, and I think there were some renderings that I had seen, and there's some in the show, it makes it almost feel like flying saucers or just sort of gently hovering over. And that was so of the time period. He was like many of his contemporaries, he was so enamored with the space race and all of the, the Kennedy, the walking on the moon, and this sort of UFO was part of that atomic age architecture. And I think why it's so successful is it is very simple. They're just concrete columns and circles, but it creates, it defines the space just enough. I think it's lasted as long because it is so flexible, but very, very memorable. It's on this very busy street. You can paint it all sorts of different ways. In the back, there's a picture of it. When was that taken? Maybe in the early 2000s, when it was yellow and blue, and now it's more muted tones. But it's just this really fun, fantastic destination because of the architecture, but also because the architecture, it was simple, but expressive. And I think that was often, the talent of the architects of this time, that, some of the design, especially for the hotels and everything, was very overwrought on purpose and theatrical, but there were also more simple expressions that were done with certain materials that really made the buildings memorable. The Giller building too is so everybody recognizes that mosaic tile tower. You can see it coming over. It's a landmark. And it was just, it's just some inexpensive tiles that are colored, just placed.
Those were not inexpensive.
To replace them now. Just put in the right place, suddenly it becomes a landmark that everybody is familiar with.
But you know what else it did? They're getting to the essence. Getting to the essence in design, that's a great expression of where it got reduced to its essence successfully. And that's the most difficult part of design. At the end, it's so simple and it's so obvious and it so works and it makes music. But the journey as the designer to go from the initial concept to get it there and do it successfully is quite a challenge. And certainly that building stood the challenge.
I think it was a combination of he knew that entrances needed to be covered, and then there wasn't a lot to work with. So you might as well go up and make a statement. Also, as we're talking about buildings that tell a story, very easily where the entrance is to that structure. You're not going to get lost. You're not going to go on the side. There's the entrance. It's one or the other. And that was part of it. It was almost like a beacon. And then, you throw in a little concrete cantilever, make it a little more interesting. There's circles also around the stage are, breeze blocks and, smiles and frowns, perhaps a nod to drama and all of that. But again, a very simple, budget-friendly solution to this civic building that really packs a big punch.
Questions? I'd love to answer questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tanya Abad. Hi, Sarah. Nice to finally meet you. Ira, good to see you. I have a question about both of your views on what's coming for the Deauville site. And I don't want to get into the history of the tragedy and the heartbreak of its current ongoing demolition, because I'll start weeping and get angry and punch a wall. So, but everything that I've heard, I'm on the planning board. And so I've heard a lot of discussion about this, is that Mr. Gary, who is a polarizing, and I love his work, almost all of it, is a polarizing architect, is coming in to build something transformative, in the words of our city elected officials, on this site. And it seems like Mr. Ross is not very interested in paying homage to what has gone there, both architecturally and culturally and historically. And the entire city, the buildings that resonate with people are these buildings that do tell stories with their architecture or with their contextualization of where they exist and how they get used. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is there a way to help bend that narrative arc and make them change their minds? Or are you not concerned about it because it'll be great?
I'm going to tell you a story that's going to kind of temper where you're coming from. And I appreciate your efforts to try and save the Deauville. I remember I had the pleasure of spending lunches sometimes with my father and Morris Lapidus and others at the Miami Beach Kiwanis Club. We used to meet every Thursday. And I remember some discussions amongst the three of us about lives of buildings. My father was a believer that all buildings aren't meant to be here forever. He said buildings had their own lives. Some were longer than others, some were shorter than others. Some had their places, some didn't. And he was not uncomfortable in recognizing that some of his work was not going to be standing with Stonehenge. That's a reality we've got to accept as well. The Deauville is a done deal. What we do need as a community is to move on with another wonderful piece of architecture in its place. And having said that, we need to look around and be more circumspect in what we really fight to save and what we say can be let go. But there's got to be a reason to save it. And sometimes that reason isn't there. And I don't want to go much farther in that. Tonight we're talking about the Giller architecture, but we just need to recognize that in the community. And we're going to be faced with that certainly here in South Florida over the next 50 years as tides rise, as climate changes, as we're faced with buildings that may one day be underwater. How do we deal with it? The time to plan is now, not 50 years from now. Time to think about how to get there is now. And we've got to recognize that every building in this city is not going to be saved. Very few will be, but they can be the best examples for the next generations going forward. Seth?
Microphone, I don't need no stinking microphone. First of all, Ira, thank you. Thank you to your dad, thank you, thanks Sarah, thank the family. What you have done for all of us has been spectacular. Now, my name is Seth Branson. I am America's senior collector of Miami memorabilia and Indiana. This past May started my 65th year collecting all these junk. That's JUNQUE. I had the honor, pleasure, and privilege, as you know, of meeting your dad several times. Humbly, he was so gracious and so warm and so cordial. I was in awe. That's number one. Number two, just a quickie. Carillon was built by Jerry Sussman, the next door neighbor on Biscayne Point, Jerry Olin, and unhappily for them, it opened in the coldest winter in the history of Miami Beach. And it did not do well. But number three, a question I hope it's not offensive. Can you comment a little bit on the relationship of particularly the dad with three other great names in our architecture. Pedro, Henry Hohauser, of course, Diplomat. Any thoughts that you can offer us on your?
Yes, Henry Hohauser, designer of the museum 301 building. My father worked for him before he became a successful architect, and had a knowledge and relationship. And if we're looking for historic threads, there was one between Hohauser and Norman Giller, and continuing on down. Morris was a friendly competitor. Morris was a half a generation older than my father. My father was the hometown boy. Morris came down from New York with all of what the New York baggage brought to town, and developed it very successfully. In later years, wonderful conversations, relationships, and things were intertwined, not in a professional basis, although we did pursue a couple of projects jointly. But I remember one conversation with Morris. He turned to me, he said, we were talking architect shop. This is inside architecture. One of the problems architects faced for so many years was collecting fees. Morris had his famous story about Ben Novak. My father had a story where he had difficult collecting fees on the Carillon from the Caskel family. They were tough developers. Morris said to me, he said, I admire what your father did in getting out of the hotels and going into the corporate and institutional work. The fees were better, and you got the steady payments. Government owed you money. They may have taken 90 days to pay, but the check didn't bounce and you didn't have to discount. There was a collegiality amongst architects in the community. Bob Swedrow, I think, is underestimated in many respects. His contribution as Morris's chief designer, just as I know my father had in his early years, a designer working under him as well, that a lot of the detail, I find myself scratching my head sometimes. Was that really the essence of my father's idea? Or did that come from the design team? Where did it come from? These are, I lay awake at night worrying about things like this, right? But you had three good examples of people that contributed well to the architectural fabric of this community, enjoyed great reputations, were participants in the collegiality of what we were all about as certainly as an architectural community, as I remember them.
don't think I need that either. I can talk louder. Okay. I'm Sarah, you serve on, I forget what the name of the thing, the Design Review Board. And well, sure, I can stand up to it and I can talk louder. Is that better? All right, I can do that. You serve on this Design Review Board, and your grandfather brought what I would describe as a severe, radical new look to Miami. Today, with that in your background and the position you have now, how do you regulate design of someone who appears initially to be so out of step and yet could make such a significant contribution?
Well, I wouldn't say that he was out of step. I mean, I would say that he was balancing what people were asking for with trends and innovation. There was a project that he did in the early 50s, late 40s, where a couple came to him and said, we want a modern house. And it's still there. It's in Lakeview. They wanted a modern house. And his interpretation of that was he created the entire first story. I don't know if it's a large house. There are no right angles in any of the rooms of the first story. And you see, and he told me the story, and you know, it was like, and then you take a look at the house, and what's really fascinating, and by the time I'd seen this picture, I'd seen all these fantastic, fabulous pictures of projects from the 1950s, and I had taken a deep dive into 50s and 60s culture. And then he shows me a picture of this house where first we saw a layout, and yeah, there was ovals and triangles, but the furnishings were very traditional. And it started almost to the point where it didn't seem like these people, and I think it was featured in a Herald article or something, and it had the picture of the woman that had hired him and her traditional furnishings in this very modern looking house. And then we had a whole discussion about how that changes sort of creep along, and even these people who wanted something very modern, it was still mixed with traditional tastes. And so I think that, he took very seriously the charge to give people what they wanted. But it had also gotten to the point where they would come to him and say, I want a Norman Giller motel. And I want that whimsy and I want that different design. There are some pictures in the exhibition too of some hotels that he did, in New Mexico and in Michigan and in in Richmond, places that you wouldn't expect to find a Miami Beach motel, but people had come to him specifically to do the sort of style. So I think, styles change and you push a little and then you step back and you let, the culture adapt, and then they suddenly want that. And then you push a little bit more and it's a dialogue that you have. And I also think, with the comment too about the design review board, that I comment that I'm going to be honest with you. I wish that the projects that were brought and built in Miami Beach were more radically progressive in their designs and were more imaginative. And, I think that Miami Beach, in no small part because of bodies like the Design Review Board, have very high quality architecture. There's things that I drive around other areas of the city and, I sort of wince at some of the projects that the municipalities allow people to build. But I like it when architects, designers, creative people push the envelope. And I don't know if that's going to happen successfully in the Deauville as promised, but I think that Miami Beach needs a little bit more, progressive ideas.
I thought of one other quick Lapidus story. The other thing that he appreciated very much in the interaction was he admired the fact that my father and I were able to work together. He struggled with having his son, who was also an architect, stayed in New York. They didn't mix as well. And I think some of it had to do with the personalities of giving the room, giving the breathing area, and those that weren't. But that struck me very much when we had that lunch and we talked about it. And it was very much from the heart. Charlie, you had a question. Thank you. Thank you. No. But, we appreciated what we saw, but we really didn't see what we were seeing. I have memories of the seniors out on the balconies. But as you got to think, the vision of Barbara Capitman from the late 70s, early 80s was phenomenal in its context. We couldn't see beyond it, but it shows how we need to be open-minded and consider possibilities instead of closing down. Yes, not every Art Deco building is still worth saving, but there are plenty that bring us joy and enjoyment. And it's part and parcel of the fabric of our community now. It's, that battle is 40 years old. We're ready for the next battle coming up.
Ira, I'm going to
Huh?
stop you now. It's getting a little on. You'll be around to answer some questions.
Definitely.
I want to, a couple things, October